Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Choi, Vice President of Asan Institute for Policy Studies. I'm very much delighted and honored to chair this session. Of course, actually, I have 5 very much distinguished speakers on our panel, so I think that I don't need to introduce any of them because everybody is well known to the public throughout their career. So, as Dr. Han mentioned in his opening remarks, one of the main pillars of sustaining liberal international order is the alliance. So we have 3 alliances in Asia-Pacific region: Korea-US, US-Japan, and US-Australia. So ROK-U.S. alliance constitutes one of the main pillars in sustaining peace and prosperity in the Asia-Pacific region. Of course, last year when President Moon Jae-in visited Washington, D.C., we agreed to make this alliance as a greater alliance. I don't know what that means. Anyhow, we have to chance to clarify what that means really in practice. So, of course, we will be discussing the North Korean issue, but actually I will save that North Korean issue for the later part of this session. But because actually it seems to me that this year we have quite similar issues, those we had in 2003 and 2005 period, like OPCON transfer issue and future commander structure, burden sharing. But before we go into details, maybe I'd like to ask each speaker to present his own understanding or assessment of current state of ROK-U.S. alliance. Of course, we used to say there's no daylight between Korea and U.S. in almost every angle. Is that the true or not? So this is a time to test that theory in practice. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Bruce Bennett from RAND Corporation, please.
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges we're going to have in the future, that in terms of our current status, is we're no longer going to be next to each other. With the U.S. forces largely down at Camp Humphreys and the ROK leadership here up in the Yongsan area, that's going to be a big bridge to cover. When our people are sitting next to each other, working closely together, that has significant advantages. And there will still be some officers who do work closely together, but not in the numbers that we've had previously. So yes, the alliance is very close. We're well coordinated. We face some very daunting threats from North Korea in nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons that all violate the liberal international order. But I think we're close in trying to deal with those, but facing this challenge of distance.
Okay, now I'd like to turn it over to Victor.
Well, first, thanks for chairing this panel. It's wonderful to be here with good colleagues and friends. So you're asking what the state of the overall alliance relationship is now? So I would say it's it's better than expected. Considering if we think about, the fact that we had 2 heads of state that were ideologically on different ends of the spectrum, lots of talk about possibly a termination of the free trade agreement, the view that we might be far apart on North Korea. At least right now, it looks like none of those things have happened. Whether it's the summit diplomacy this spring or the renegotiation of KORUS, I think things didn't turn out as bad as many people thought it might. This is not to say there aren't any challenges in the future. I think there are many challenges. But, I think contrary to most people's predictions, the alliance is probably in better shape than many would have expected, I don't know, a year ago at this time. But still, every alliance that the United States has had throughout its post-war history has gone through ups and downs. Has gone through all sorts of trials and tribulations when new leaders come in with different ideologies. And in most cases, in the end, the alliance has survived those changes in ideologies and leadership and thinking, because the issues for the most part remain the same. they remain consistent and the same. And for the most part, regardless of personality or ideology, national interest always seems to be the final determinant of policy choices. So right now it looks like that's the case, but like I said, we still have challenges coming.
Okay, so better than expected, but challenges ahead of us. So maybe I can ask the same question to Professor Kim Sung-han.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Asan Institute for giving me this wonderful opportunity to speak to distinguished experts, around the world. As you may agree, for the last 70 years, the United States has been leading liberal international order based on, as Dr. Choi already pointed out, based on alliances, global open economy, and the rules and institutions, and the promotion of democracy and human rights. But if you look around, particularly after President Trump took office, I think a variety of challenges are being raised on the economic front, in the sense that we are witnessing growing trade protectionism under the banner of America First. On the security front, however, I think our skepticism and cynicism have been a little bit reduced in the process of dealing with Syria, North Korea, etc., which means President Trump has recognized the importance of alliances. Previously, he was, apparently having a very skeptical view about traditional alliances, but this has been going through some sort of good readjustment. By the way, still a question is being raised about whether this kind of two things. One is Trump's transactional approach to alliances on the one hand, and strategic alliances such as ROK-U.S. or Japan-U.S. Alliances. These two things, whether these two things can be compatible with each other under the President Trump administration. So I think we have to see whether these two things can be compatible in the years ahead, even after U.S.-North Korea summit meeting has taken place.
Thank you, Professor Kim Sung-han. Now I'd like to ask the same question to Danny Russel. Now you have freedom of speech nowadays. You can enjoy that at this point.
I'm a great believer in freedom of speech. Thank you, Professor Choi. And I agree with Professor Kim in the sense that the U.S. ROK alliance is just about to undergo a pretty significant stress test through this series of meetings with the North Koreans. So it makes it hard to give an overall assessment of the state of the alliance and state of the relationship. My government experience conditioned me to think in terms of the political relationship, the security relationship, the economic relationship, and the people-to-people relationship. And on the political side, as Victor alluded to, there's been a dramatic role reversal in the U.S.-ROK relationship from a liberal U.S. government to a conservative one, from a conservative ROK government to a liberal one. And in both cases, the transition has been abrupt and in some cases shocking. It's hard for each to adjust to that new reality. And after all, the last time there was this kind of political mismatch, as Victor remembers, in the Bush-Nomuhyun era, it was a challenge for the relationship. We should expect it. Now, on top of that, bad behavior by North Korea is always the great unifying force. It does miracles for alliance solidarity. When North Korea, conversely, is operating one of its charm offensives, a New Yorker, so I think of it as the three-card Monte game, it gets a lot harder, and driving wedges is a big part of his strategy. In terms of the security relationship, I think the Mil-Mil alliance is very solid. The Combined Forces Command structure holds. I think the US military is a very steady and influential advocate for the US-ROK alliance, and particularly in the Trump administration is able to serve as something of a brake against impulsive and risky decision-making. There is, I don't know the numbers, but there must be hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Americans with experience in Korea as service members. And that's a very powerful constituency in favor of the alliance. And there are other strategic, practical, and even kind of emotional ties there on the security side. In terms of trade, I think we've seen that Minister Kim and Ambassador Lighthizer have managed to slap a Band-Aid over the rupture in the KORUS FTA agreement. But fundamentally, I think it appears that we're back in the battering ram school of trade talks, as opposed to an effort to sort of find a reciprocal, balanced, mutually acceptable market opening set of formulas. And then lastly, on people-to-people, it's hard to quantify, but the polling that I've seen in South Korea suggests that there is a real fall-off in support for the alliance among the young generation. And that, of course, is tremendously worrisome. I saw a poll that suggested that incoming cadets to the ROK military listed the United States over North Korea, Japan, or China as a strategic threat to South Korea, so that's pretty worrisome. Conversely, on the US side, this isn't about age, but you have the departure of the great lions of the Senate and the champions of the US-ROK, as well as the broader Asia-Pacific engagement strategy. And so I think that there is some fraying at the margins. Just the last people-to-people point I'd mention is that I saw that at a time when the Chinese themselves are falling over themselves to send their own children to American universities or to Australian universities, more Korean students are studying in China than are studying in the United States, and I think that has long-term implications.
Okay, thank you, Danny. But actually, Asan usually conducts a poll on this ROK-U.S. alliance or the country favorability. Still, I think we got very high support level for the ROK-U.S. alliance, more than 90%. So we asked the questions. Actually, the support for alliance among the young generation, actually age 20s and 30s, has gone up in recent poll. So actually, the people in 30s and 40s, actually 40s and 50s actually remain same about very big. But actually, people in 20s and 30s and people in 60s and beyond actually responded enthusiastically in sustaining and holding the alliance as far as they can. Of course, they also support for the Trilateral security cooperation with also Japan. So that's actually, if you, after this session, you should go out and check out this. This is the screen on that. It shows all the statistics of a public poll. Or you can come to our webpage for updated information about country favorability for that. Okay, last but least, actually, my dear friend, Professor Soeya-san, so you can take this a moment to present your thought on the ROK-U.S. alliance.
In general.
In general.
Yeah. Well, unlike my previous speakers who are all heavyweights intellectually and in the policy community, I have much freedom of speech. And so I'd like to, under the pressure of this panel, I try to say something different. But I'd like to start by saying I have no doubt whatsoever as to the robustness of the alliance relationship between US and Korea and between US and Japan. But there are hiccups, or there are problems in managing this alliance. And as to possible potential problems in the context of US ROK alliance, of course, President Trump is the biggest factor. And if we look back on the post-war record of American presence on the peninsula, there are two occasions whereby US tried to withdraw troops from the peninsula. The first one was, of course, Nixon, period. And this was virtually entrusting China as to the management of Korean affairs. And second time was President Carter. And the US-China were moving toward diplomatic normalization. So one commonality under those two circumstances was stable, good relations between US and China. But today, perhaps we don't expect that to happen. But under those circumstances, President Trump's America First policy, if applied theoretically to the American military presence in the region, including Japan, there is a, even if slight, possibility for US begin to think about it or move in the direction. And our nightmare would be that could happen in the process of negotiation with North Korea. Perhaps we are going to discuss this. And in between the entrance in approach and the exit in approach, so there are a variety of issues, and I think US might fluctuate between these two theories, depending on how President Trump feels like in the process of talking to North Korea. And of course, in the management of ROK kind of US alliance, I think this is a missing link, which is Japan, of course. And militarily, ROK-U.S. alliance would not function without American presence in Japan. I think from the American perspective, presence in this part of the world, in Japan and Korea, of course, regarded as a set, for America to consider its military options and operations. And so given that, I think it's terribly sorry to see the current state of political relationship between Japan and South Korea, which would prevent both countries from making the best use of these two sets of alliances of the United States.
Thank you. Actually, I will come back to the Trilateral Security Cooperation later phase, but actually, it seems to me that whenever there is a provocation done by North Korea, there's no daylight between the ROK and US. But as you mentioned, when North Korea start kinds of charm offense vis-a-vis South Korea, there could be some kind of slight differences between South Korea and the United States in dealing with this. So in your perspective, do you see any difference between the US and ROK at this point of time in dealing with North Korea? Maybe I can start with Danny, because you raised that question. You mentioned that possibility of there was some kind of split, maybe difference between the ROK and the US in dealing with North Korea in general, more specifically how we are going to denuclearize North Korea. Maybe there's a question I can ask you to. Please, Danny.
I think traditionally the US and the ROK are dealing from a consistent basis, and the Trump administration in practice, up until perhaps early March, although they disavowed the policy of quote-unquote strategic patience, was implementing it. There was a lot of consistency both in Seoul and in Tokyo in terms of the practical application of sanctions, pressure, and deterrence, while attempting to keep a door open to negotiation and diplomacy. There was a dramatic shift, I think, that was all scripted by Kim Jong-un, beginning with the New Year's Day statement, or perhaps accurately beginning with the November 29th declaration of victory after the ICBM launch, and identifying South Korea as the weak link in the chain and using the Olympics as the point of vulnerability for applying pressure. And then the shocker that President Bush either invited himself to Pyongyang or, excuse me, President Trump either invited himself to Pyongyang or accepted an explicit or an implicit invitation to meet with Kim Jong-un. And that's radically altered everybody's equation. So it's a little bit like the joke of the guy who fell off a 30-story window and was heard as he passed the 10th floor saying, "So far, so good." We don't really know how this is going to land and what the implications are for the U.S. and the ROK alliance. But you could say, to borrow from Hollywood movies, that there's a bit of a love triangle in the U.S. ROK-DPRK relationship, where the North Koreans have always focused on the United States, the ROK has focused on improving relations with the North, and the U.S. has sometimes sometimes veered one way, sometimes the other, but it doesn't seem that into them, I think. So the basic approach that is going to be put under great stress is the unified field approach to the DPRK, because the DPRK is very deliberately, and I would argue pretty cleverly, playing to the differences in Washington and in Seoul's respective politics and their respective interests. And the recent statement by Kim Jong-un that he was prepared to consider a suspension of ICBM and intermediate range ballistic missile tests, specifically meaning that maybe Los Angeles and Guam are not in immediate jeopardy, but Japan is, and South Korea is just one more indicator of an adroit ability to exploit differences, and this is a huge challenge for both of us.
Thank you. Professor Kim Sung-han, can you?
You asked about some differences between Korea and the United States in dealing with North Korea. But when it comes to Korea, South Korea, and the United States, you probably refer to the government, right?
Yes.
At the government level, I think there is little difference in dealing with North Korea because they are taking, I believe, quite quote-unquote a realistic approach, which means they are not trying to come up with kind of a maximum results. The reason why I'm pointing out this kind of dimension is that Seoul and Washington may come across some possible challenges in the process of trying to meet conditions for denuclearization. According to South Korea's special envoy to North Korea, Kim Jong-un was quoted as saying, there is no reason to possess nuclear weapons as long as the nuclear threat is eliminated and regime security is guaranteed. So this is a conditional denuclearization, which means we have to meet those conditions. Then how? How Seoul and Washington will be able to meet those conditions in a realistic way? How to eliminate military threat to North Korea? If you take a long-time view of North Korea, that is to withdraw U.S. forces from the Korean Peninsula. How to guarantee North Korea's regime? If you take North Korea's long-time kind of a position that is likely to be the replacement of the armistice treaty with peace treaty between North Korea and the United States. So these kind of things, details, right? And even if you hit the grand bargain, then the next more important thing is how to implement that grand bargain so that the intervals between some stages could be as shortened as possible. We have been kind of tricked by and betrayed by this kind of a very gradualistic and synchronized approach for the last 25 years. So meeting those conditions and implementation of the grand bargain will be playing as a big challenge between us, and in this process we might have many more differences than we had expected.
So, Victor, do you agree with Song Han on this point about the devil's in the detail?
Sure. I mean, I think yes, I do think the devil is in the details. I mean, I should preface this by saying we're all for peace. Everybody's for peace. Everybody is for a moratorium testing. I think everybody's for all these things. And right now, it appears as though the two allies are on the same page as we, head for this summit on Friday. Both of them speaking in very positive terms about the hopeful results of the summit. Sometimes I'm a little concerned that there's too much positivity out there, which has the effect of raising expectations. And I mean, Danny remembers this well. I mean, usually when you prepare these summits, you want to lower expectations so that the summit is seen as a success. But we're in a position now where both sides are raising expectations. But in that sense, everybody seems to be on the same page. I would say there are three challenges in this regard. The first is we all have a sense of what we want from North Korea in these upcoming summits, obviously denuclearization and a ban on testing, things of those nature. But I see very little discussion in the press and in the public about what we're willing to give. And that, as many people in this room who've been involved in these negotiations knows, the more difficult conversation is not what you want, but what you're willing to give to North Korea. And there could be differences there between what the allies are willing to give. The second, I think, is that for the United States, the so-called objective or the policy has always been something called CVID, right? Complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. If you think about that term CVID, it reflects an American view that this is a problem that needs to be solved, right? But my guess is that if you look deep into the minds and hearts of most South Koreans, ultimately they don't see this as a problem that can be solved. And they see it more as a problem that has to be managed. And I would argue that that's probably the view of the Chinese, almost certainly, probably the view of the Russians as well, not the view of the Japanese. But that in terms of, at the core, could be another area where there's divergence. And then finally, I think, there have been references throughout the morning made to unconventional thinking. And I think if unconventional thinking leads to a good outcome, that's great. But, I'm sorry, unconventional thinking, unconventional action, right? If it leads to a good outcome, that's terrific. But perhaps I'm just too much of a deep state globalist. What you don't want is unconventional thinking and unconventional actions to fail when the stakes are very high. And arguably, that's where we are right now. The stakes are quite high. And so, yes, generally unconventional thinking and actions are great if it leads to a good outcome, But if it doesn't lead to a good outcome, you want to at least make sure it's harmless. But I think the concern is that the stakes are so high that it would not be harmless if unconventional thinking failed.
Okay, now I'd like to ask Professor Soeya-san first, and then coming back to Bruce. Okay, Soeya-san.
Yeah, thank you. I think, I mean, to understand the North Korean moves, I think Pyongyang dual track is very critical, as is obvious to everybody. I mean, combination of nuclear weapons and economic reconstruction. And so if Pyongyang remains the key scheme, then I think likelihood of North Korea giving up nuclear weapon is very slim, because this is the ultimate sort of condition to economic reconstruction. And so if denuclearization becomes possible, this is another scenario whereby we can come up with an alternative scheme which would replace nuclear weapons as the ultimate source of regime survival. And I think this is what Kim Jong-un is talking about in terms of ultimate establishment of peace regime in the peninsula. And so this is exit. This is exit, a theoretical endpoint in this process. And one thing which is important in this context is, I think, China. I think there is no problem as far as Chinese, not only Korean policy, but regional policies goes. I mean, to have peaceful, scheme on the peninsula, and possibly withdrawal of U.S. troops from the peninsula. I think this is what China may want ultimately. And so between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping, I don't know what they talked in Beijing, but as to this ultimate point, end point, I think there is perfect congruence of interest between North Korea and China. And but our approach, I mean, Japan, Korea included, is in a way a grand bargain. I mean, total denuclearization at the entrance. Unless that prospect is guaranteed, we are not going to move in this process. So there is a huge gap between North Korean and Chinese approach and our approach. And so the question is, I think the real question in real world is whether, led by President Trump, we are going to get on this track of negotiation, leading to this ultimate endpoint which they anticipate, or we stop, if there is no prospect to move. And if we stop at this endpoint, I think there is a high possibility that North Korea reverts to the original, kind of further development of nuclear weapons and so forth. So this is a very critical choice for us, and it's not easy. And I don't know how we would succeed. And one worry which some have is President Moon Jae-in may eventually gravitate toward this exit approach if regional progress in North-South dialogue and relations are realized. But at this point, I understand Korean government is saying exactly the same thing as American and Japanese governments. So there is reasonable cooperation among the three. But President Moon Jae-in's own private or personal, orientation, and he may be more sympathetic with this exit kind of approach. I don't know. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And so whether this gap would eventually become, surfaced, I think this is a potential gap. And so it's up to how summits proceed. First of all, between North and South, and then U.S. and North Korea, and what would come out of this. After that, we can perhaps reasonably see and tell what the prospect of this kind of tension between entrance and exit approaches.
Okay, Bruce?
I think as I've talked to Koreans and to American colleagues about this issue, I sense that my Korean colleagues tend to have more faith that Kim Jong-un's intent is reasonable, that he is going to try to come to a better outcome. Americans are still very skeptical We have a long history of various negotiations with North Korea where North Korea has fundamentally violated what they've agreed to do, sometimes during the process of making the agreement. And so part of the issue here is, from an American perspective, many of the commitments that Kim Jong-un has been making over the last period of time are words, and words are cheap. We want to see action. We want to see something change. What kind of thing do I mean? My own personal concept is, I think Kim Jong-un next Monday ought to turn 5 nuclear weapons over to France, the most neutral of the 5 nuclear powers allowed to possess nuclear weapons by the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and do so under supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency. If indeed they really are nuclear weapons that would work, the French will eventually say that, and Kim Jong-un will get tremendous benefits internally by being able to say, see, I'm proven to be a nuclear power. And we'll get tremendous benefits, the US and ROK, because we'll have gotten rid of 5 nuclear weapons, but also picked up a fair amount of information about what is really involved. So in many ways, it's a win-win for both sides. But until Kim Jong-un is prepared to give up something, to do something, rather than to promise to do something, it's hard to take him seriously for most Americans. That's a key threshold that we're interested in. The other kind of thing that I think, as an American, my thinking has been going very broadly. Yes, it could be that Kim Jong-un said within the last week that he'll allow American troops to stay on the peninsula, not concerned about that. But maybe he'll get to the meeting with Trump and say, no, no, I'm not going to do that, on the one hand. Or could he come to the meeting with Trump on the other hand and say, you know, I really want to demonstrate a change in relationships. So will you put some American troops in North Korea? Now, immediately, I expected more chuckles than that, because I'm not expecting him to do that. But what if he did? And think about it in the context of where he is. The US wants him to give up all of his nuclear weapons. And yet he lives in a world where nuclear weapons are common in his region. Who's going to give him a nuclear umbrella? Is he going to trust China to do that once he's given up his nuclear weapons? Or Russia? I'd be a little surprised if he did. Could he at some point ask the US to do that? Well, that is really far out there. But I think we ought to be prepared for that kind of transition. How well are we prepared for the summit and the possibilities, because we really don't know his intent and what he is planning to do?
Actually, tomorrow, the final plenary session is solely devoted to North Korea. So, of course, I have so many questions to ask, but actually, for the sake of this conversation, I like to skip those parts and coming to the more general questions. Okay, everything goes well. So it seems to me that we have to think about the roles and missions of ROK and US alliance in the context of illiberal international order. So it seems to me, but nowadays we are focusing more on Korean peninsula-wise issues. But what about the regional implication and roles and missions of ROK and US alliance should perform into the future? Maybe we have to think about the global roles South Korea can play through its relations with the United States. Almost every statement, joint statement made by the president of two countries contains some meaning or implication for expanding role of the alliance. But sometimes South Koreans are very reluctant to go regional, go global, despite all the statements we made. So let's say North Korean issue solved, not completely, partially, in a going positive way. So what should be the roles and missions of ROK and US alliance in a new context of illiberal international order? Maybe you go first? Bruce, are you ready?
Oh, absolutely.
Sure.
That's one. That's a topic I've been urging people to consider, because for many people, once there is a peace agreement, treaty, whatever you want to call it, many people will say, what's the purpose of the alliance anymore? Why don't we ditch it and pull American troops out of Korea? Many Koreans will say, we don't need them here anymore. And if you're not convinced that's the case, think about the situation with THAAD down in the southern part of Korea. Has the Americans been allowed to set up that weapon defense system? No. And if suddenly there's no longer a North Korean threat because we have a peace agreement, what's going to happen? So I think we need to be redefining the purpose of the alliance. And part of it is we're going to be in a 5 to 10 year transition period. Even if there is some form of peace regime declared on Friday, it's going to be 5 or 10 years before I'm really going to fully believe it and be comfortable with the evolution, because it's going to take that long for all the details to play out. Just one example. Can we really have peace if North Korea indoctrinates its people that the U.S. is their eternal adversary? I don't think that that's consistent. So there are many things that are going to have to play out. That's one reason for the alliance continuing. Second, though, is the regional issue you're suggesting. I think you need to have a regionally defined U.S. and South Korea role. In some of the defense reform plans, South Korea began to put together a force that would have a regional role, be able to deploy off peninsula to do things. I think we have to look at the fundamentals of the American forces. The one U.S. brigade combat team in Korea today is an armor brigade combat team. If North Korea is no longer the adversary, what's the armor team for? Is it here because of China? Because you can't move it very easily anywhere else? Is that why it's here, to defend North and South Korea against China? Or do we need a more deployable airborne or air assault or marine force that can play a regional role? Shouldn't we be defining those purposes today so that we adjust and make the alliance what we want for the future, not for the past?
Of course, if you allow me, I'd like to send a question to Song-Han, because actually, for example, the last points Bruce mentioned is about what we used to call strategic flexibility of USFK. Is it right time for us to think about the strategic flexibility of USFK, and also can South Korea go along with that and participate in that kind of mission? Yeah. So what do you think, Song-Han?
I think Choi Kang made a big assumption that everything goes well.
Yes.
Then we have to deal with this kind of question. But I don't think everything will be going well. That sounds like a problem, right?
Yeah.
Nevertheless, if CVID is almost getting realized, I think it will be the right time for us to think about the future of USFK, the future of ROK-U.S. alliance, which means, as Bruce already pointed out, we will probably have to redefine the role of USFK, redefine the purpose, the rationale of ROK-U.S. alliance. I think the existing strategic alliance, which was agreed between Lee Myung-bak and Obama and Park Geun-hye and Obama, previously George W. Bush administrations, I think is still valid because we agreed to go beyond the Korean Peninsula, and we tried to address some regional and global challenges. That's why we had to come across some misunderstandings, as if United States expects ROK to play like expeditionary forces together with the United States. Probably not, even after the things have been going well. I think first thing to do is transform kind of a ground force-based USFK to naval air-based kind of presence, and U.S. ROK alliance maybe might be readjusted to deal with some non-traditional security challenges in the whole region. Safety of
HADR,
HADR and sea lanes of communication safety and piracy, smuggling, human smuggling. So these kind of new challenges will be the key agenda for us to address when everything is going well and when it comes to redefinition of the alliance.
Okay, thank you, Professor Kim. And okay, I very feel obliged to ask the same question to Danny Russel. You have been dealing this with as an assistant secretary. Please.
Well, what would we do with the ROK alliance in the event of a credible peace breaking out on the Korean Peninsula? Is what in government we used to call a high-class problem. Would that we had to worry about that. And frankly, I think we're getting pretty far ahead of ourselves in trying to game out that denouement. But let's just stipulate that sort of the best case scenario unfolds over the coming months. I think that there will inevitably be an essential role for the US-ROK alliance in the first instance in maintaining deterrence. Even in a best case scenario, the reduction and the elimination of the threat from the DPRK is a long-term proposition. Second, there's a transition in the US-ROK and in specifically the ROK military and political activity that began in the Obama administration, which is the expanded focus, as Professor Kim alluded to, off-peninsula security activities and cooperation. And I think that with a diminution of the urgency of the threat from the north, we would expect to see an expansion of a willingness by the ROK government to engage in regional stability activities as well as more on a global basis. The principal obstacle, I think, to the healthy development of a genuinely effective US-ROK regional collaboration is the deterioration of the relations between Korea and Japan. There is no realistic and durable prospect for sustaining and expanding, I think, regional security, regional stability that doesn't involve the elimination of the existing political obstacles to full alliance and trilateral coordination. I'd flag that as a very important challenge. Third, I think there's a role for a future US-ROK alliance and partnership in defense of the, for lack of a better term, global liberal international order. That there is a brewing contest between universality and spheres of influence. And it's highly visible in the Asia-Pacific region. The question is whether international law, global norms, universal rights apply across the board, or whether they are subject to a kind of opt-out by strong, dominant regional powers. Moreover, there's an open question, there was an allusion already to the deployment of THAAD by Professor Kim, as to whether the coercive and punitive power of the regional power actor, China, will come to be the decisive factor in ROK policymaking going forward. So I think that you know, from the wider vantage point, the U.S. and the ROK are natural allies. That only a thriving partnership with the United States can protect the ROK from these forces and these pressures. And by the same token, only a thriving partnership with the ROK on the part of the United States can anchor universal rights and principles firmly on the Asian continent.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. Victor, you'd like to add something else?
So what would be the role of the U.S.-Korea alliance if there were peace? So I have a couple of the first observation is that I think it's actually easier for the U.S.-Korea alliance to be global than it is to be regional. Precisely for the reasons that Danny just mentioned in terms of the difficulty with Japan, but you know, whether it's on climate change or ODA or other, you know, general public goods issues in the international system, there has been and there always will be great potential for the U.S.-Korea alliance to contribute. But if there were actually peace on the Korean Peninsula, you know, I think it actually might be, I don't want to sound like a contrarian, but I think it actually might be harder in some sense to promote a larger regional role for the alliance, in part because I think in some cases the subtext of past cooperation between the United States and Korea outside of the peninsula has been viewed by some governments, not all, but some governments in Korea as a quid pro quo for getting U.S. cooperation on issues closer to home, like North Korea. So the famous example here, of course, is the decision by a progressive government in South Korea to deploy ground troops to Iraq, not necessarily because they believed in the mission or the cause, but because the subtext was some sort of quid pro quo for better coordination of policy on North Korea. And then the second thing, and this is all in the realm of hypothetical, so nobody's right or wrong, but I really wonder if we had peace on the Korean Peninsula in some sort of peace agreement, would that make the ROK more willing to speak out with regard to China's actions in the South China Sea? For some reason, I don't think so. I think, if anything, a resolution of the problem on the peninsula will bring into very stark relief the China problem in the U.S.-Korea alliance. It's somewhat muted now because of the North Korea problem, but it, I think, would become a very prominent feature in a much more complicated alliance relationship.
Thank you. And Soeya-san, so you can make some comments about the roles and missions, because actually Japan and the U.S. actually have expanded the roles and redefined their roles in meeting the challenges at the regional, at the global level. So,
but the assumption remains the same, right? Peace on the peninsula.
Yeah, assuming that.
I would go even, more extreme scenario, unification of Korea. Well, I recall as a young scholar, since around the beginning of the 90s, after the end of the Cold War, I have made arguments that the best scenario for the future of Northeast Asia is for United Korea and Japan to co-host American presence. And there are eras to this, because at that time there was not much China threat perception and argument in Japan. Still continuation of the post-war, handling of China. And there was even intentional, attempts not to talk about China threat. And even America pushes Japan in that direction. So that's been, I think, in a way, traditional post-war Japanese-China policy. And of course now things have changed, assumptions have changed. So if I make the same argument today, maybe I would get totally different reactions. But here the problem is the same, I think, which is, this is virtually a question as to US-Korea alliance, whether or not it can get out of the mold of Korean Peninsula security. And we are now talking on that assumption. Therefore, kind of regionalizing American presence in the region is, I think, a common sort of thing to consider virtually by all regional countries residing between US and China, two superpowers. And under this context, I think Korea and Japan should be the first pair and who should be able to talk as to the sort of common sort of value of American presence in the region. And in doing so, of course, talking about China is very important, but also what we expect from the United States is also equally an important question. And this may extend to Southeast Asian countries or Australia. And for Japan, this virtually means decreasing American massive presence, military presence in Japan in a larger regional context. Of course, it's only a theoretical argument, and there are many hurdles to do this. But theoretically, I think this sort of picture should be discussed and sought after, whether or not they're feasible. And so of course, this requires, again, as mentioned by Dan Russell, reasonably, good relations between Japan and South Korea. Japan and South Korea sharing sort of same view, as to the future of the regional order, and even as to the role of China. And we cannot do this in the context of confronting China. We cannot, do this forever. I think ultimate objective of our regional cooperation should be coexistence with China in one way or another. But if worrying things coming from China, of course, we have to deal with it. But in order to do that, we cannot do that without the presence of the United States. But this does not mean that we are relying on the US in order to confront China or encircle China or whatever. And so currently, I think there is a huge gap between Korean perception about China and Japanese perception about China, and which needs to be filled in one way or another in coming years for this scenario to be realized eventually.
So there should be more direct bilateral talks between Korea and Japan over China issue, maybe between between the US and Korea as well.
Also, perhaps,
so,
yeah.
Yes.
I have once tried Japan, Australia, Korea trilateral dialogue, which was very, very interesting because we had to use different parts of brain.
Okay, on that point, actually, I'd like to ask you a question because actually, let's come back to the current time, and then Korea, Japan have signed the GSOMIA, General Security of Military Information.
Yeah.
And then, so we are doing the trilateral, the missile, the exercise. So what should be the next step Japan wants to do with South Korea? Or from US perspective, you can, maybe Bruce, maybe I'd like to ask the question to Professor Soeya on that. From Japanese perspective, what should be the next step you'd like to see in the security cooperation?
If we can, sign some kind of official agreement, I mean, that's ideal. But of course, that's not going to happen realistically.
So general
speaking.
agreement of security cooperation between the two countries.
Maybe, maybe some policy statement like the one which Japan did with Australia, and the one Korea also did during
with Australia,
period with Australia. And the same kind of things should be possible between Japan and South Korea because this security declaration has nothing to do with traditional, balance of power or military alliance, more of a soft security cooperation or multilateral cooperation, and UNPKO type of activities. And I see no reason why Japan and South Korea cannot do that.
Okay. Is there anyone who would like to say something on the trilateral security cooperation or bilateral between Korea and Japan? Victor?
Well, I mean, I don't think anybody on this panel is going to disagree with the importance of that. And I think I would just add that it's important for another reason, which is that I think there are a number of things that North Korea is after in terms of its strategy, but one of them very clearly is to try to decouple peninsular security from the US-Japan alliance. And if that's the case, I mean, there are things that we can do in terms of information sharing, missile defense, and others to try to thwart that particular objective. But there also are political things that we can do. and the sort of statement that Soeya-san is talking about are one of the things that can be done. It's clearly not unprecedented for South Korea. They've done one with, as you mentioned, with Australia. You've had there've been many different meetings and discussions and statements with China. So I don't think it's out of the realm of plausibility.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so
just a footnote. I think if my memory is correct, former President Nomu현 government was somewhat interesting in the sense that Korea-Japan relationship was doing okay when Koizumi government was having a summit meeting with North Korea and treating North Korea very well. But once Prime Minister Koizumi turned his back to North Korea, then Nomu현 government turned his back to Japan too. Which means if everything goes well, you made a big assumption, right?
Yes.
In the process of establishing a peace mechanism on the Korean Peninsula, I think Japan will have to play a big role in normalizing its diplomatic relationship with North Korea. If this kind of relationship is literally normalized, I think ROK government will be able to see Japan more objectively as it is. And they will come up with more space to think about the future of the region, future of our bilateral and trilateral relationship from more strategic point of view.
Okay.
That's my footnote.
Thank you. Now I would like to open the floor for questions. Okay, Gary? Is Mike? Mike's coming.
You're going to have to shout.
So I'd like to ask the panel to comment on the special measures agreement that's currently being talked about between Seoul and Washington. In a way, it's an awkward time to be haggling over money when we're trying to coordinate our strategy toward North Korea. So what's the danger that disagreements in the SMA talks will complicate our efforts to present a common front to Pyongyang?
Okay. I'd like to collect a couple more questions. Okay, gentlemen, just right.
I'm Matthew Silberman from the Korea JoongAng Daily. Thank you all for your contributions. So regarding the health of U.S.-Korea communication, McMaster and his counterpart Chung in Korea had a great relationship, but now Bolton's on board with very different views, no such relationship with Chung. And one of the surest signs of a healthy alliance, the presence of a U.S. ambassador in Korea, is still missing from the picture. So in practical terms, how much does all of that matter? And another question, as we know, Trump has gone pretty far to demonstrate his seriousness about a military plan for North Korea. So how plausible is it that things could spiral from here, again, if Trump or Kim become disillusioned with diplomacy?
Okay, thank you. And Patrick?
Thank you. Patrick Cronin from the Center for New American Security. I feel like I have to say that John Bolton and Mr. Chung had a great meeting, by the way, in Washington just a few days ago. So I think they've established a new relationship. I wanted to ask the panel about the consequences of failure in North Korean talks, especially if we get into a first phase, if we get into some months of this process, in say 2019 and beyond, things come crashing down the way previous attempts at arms control or dealing with the nuclear issue have failed. This is no longer the 90s where we had a three-phase agreement we could kind of put on hold. It seems like there may be more pressure on the United States and South Korea. There may be differences between Moon and Trump a year or two into this process. So it'd be interesting to hear the speculation if this fails.
Okay. Now we have three questions of special measures agreement. There's a burden sharing issue. Second is like, of course, diplomatic issue about the communication between the two capitals. And then third is kinds of what the consequences of failure. Are we ready? are you ready to tackle those things? So who can say something on the SMA? Danny, can you say something on the SMA? Okay, sure.
Sure. The argument and the haggling over money, which is what the special measures agreement is, or cost sharing, burden sharing agreements always are, is always rough. And it's going to be particularly rough in a US administration that has taken such a mercantilist and transactional attitude towards partnerships and towards alliances. President Trump has repeatedly invoked the specter of Korea as a free rider, has vocally made the case that America has gotten screwed by its allies. Funabashi-san earlier described the mindset as turning allies into vassals and the US military into mercenaries. Whether that's fair or not, the expectation that the demand from the Trump administration for more direct funding seems like an inevitability. I know that one of the challenges for the Korean government in this context is to educate President Trump and educate the administration about the extent to which the Korean government is already underwriting and subsidizing the presence of US troops. But if the fundamental premise of the US alliance has always been that at the end of the day, the United States is present in Korea with 28,500 plus troops in its own interests for our own greater national security, that rationale is under stress, if not repudiated. And I think that while it is a little bit less likely to surface while the threat from North Korea is imminent, other than as a negotiating lever, we are looking at, I think, a potential crisis over the issue of free rider versus burden sharing.
I think on that, actually, I've done research on these SMA issues. This is 10th SMA, but this is for the first time is a presidential agenda. For the first time. So I assume maybe South Korea will experience some much tougher pressure coming from Washington, D.C., because President Trump has clearly stated 3 times already. So maybe, I don't know what the good solution for this, but anyhow, maybe U.S. will ask South Korea to pay more. That's one issue. Second, on that return, maybe South Korea can ask some transparency on the use of financial assistance we give to the United States. Money is given to the United States, how is spent, and then what about, is there any kinds of leftover from previous calendar year? So that was one of the main issues politically in Seoul. So maybe if there's kinds of measures to ensure the transparency and also effective use of financial contribution made by South Korea could be acceptable as a kind of offset to increase the burden South Korea will cover. That's my reaction to that. About this ambassador, who can answer?
I have a question to you.
Me?
Yeah. Do you think?
No way.
Do you think, and SMA?
Yes.
Do you think President Trump knows that ROK provides the United States with free lands? According to SOFA, it stipulates that ROK provides the United States with lands for USFK presence, right?
Yes.
That is a big difference, yeah? From
actually,
USFJ.
That's right.
Yeah.
But it's more complicated issue. That means I don't think President Trump has heard about that yet. So maybe if there's so burden sharing is one thing, security responsibility is another thing. But if you put this burden sharing issue within a bigger framework of defense responsibility sharing, we can argue or justify our arguments, and then they say we have done enough. But I don't know, it's the president understanding matters most this time. I don't know, big to you.
That's thinking way too conventionally.
Sorry about that. Okay, Bruce, you'd like to add?
Well, the thing I was going to add is, if you're talking about land, that's one thing. But remember, the U.S. is only asking for contributions on the operations and maintenance part of the cost of our soldiers. So we're giving Korea free soldiers. Korea's not paying anything towards their salaries, and free military equipment. Korea's not being asked to pay for any of that. On the other hand, I don't think the Americans usually understand how small the South Korean military budget is, and that the South Korean National Assembly is not just going to give another trillion won to pay for heightened burden sharing. So what is it that the United States wants South Korea not to be investing in to pay a higher burden sharing? Because that's normally going to come out of military equipment, and that budget is already very tight. From a military perspective, I'd love to see the American argument on what you want to see South Korea forgo in terms of future capabilities.
Oh, yep, they're working on it. It's a Defense Reform 2.0, so I don't know what will the content of Defense Reform 2.0, but it seems to me that it will be affected by the outcome of this upcoming summit.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens. Now, I'd like to go to the second round of questions. Minister Han? Mike?
On this question of SMA, one virtue of President Trump is that he tends to bark much louder than he bites. And so once the negotiation process comes, as long as he can get some credit or he can get something that he can spin as a great victory, just as in the case of the trade issue, I think we will find a way to deal with it. But the issue that I want to deal with is the last question that Mr. Choi raised. What would happen if and when peace breaks out to the U.S.-Korea alliance? And in that connection, one question we can think about or ask is what happened to NATO after the Soviet Union went down. NATO not only thrived, but it is growing, maybe even being strengthened. More countries contributing, maybe at the urging of Mr. Trump to financially to NATO. The difference between NATO and U.S.-Korea alliance is that it was before two things. One was before the rise of the so-called illiberal international order, thinking it was before Mr. Trump in the United States. And also, it was before there was any kind of resistance, organized negative attitude or thinking regarding NATO in Europe or in the United States. this brings us to the domestic politics of both countries. And in the case of Korea, there is even though the survey shows that there is a large majority in favor of the alliance, there is an organized and well-established, including within the political leadership of some parties who have negative attitude toward the alliance and quite willing to take advantage of any kind of peace that will weaken the rationale for the alliance. In fact, they are doing some things in order to weaken that particular alliance right now. And I think that is something we have to look into. So even though there is a parallel between NATO and US-Korea alliance, there's a great deal of difference that makes it probably more difficult to maintain, much less strengthen the alliance after the situation changes.
Thank you, Minister Han. Actually, that's a comment instead of question. So maybe I can ask what would be the U.S. domestic political background for sustaining the ROK-U.S. alliance if there's something on peace is achieved, and then is whether it's sustainable to maintain that kinds of level or lead to changes in the ROK-U.S. alliance. Maybe I can ask Bruce or anyone, Danny, or like. Or while you are thinking, I can collect more questions. Okay, Soeya-san, okay.
And may I also respond to the second set of questions?
Yes.
As to U.S. military planning and so forth. But as to this question, very quickly, I think in a way Japan has experienced this after the end of the Cold War. When the Soviet threat is gone, there was a time when many Japanese began to argue what the value of U.S.-Japan alliance. And same thing may happen, in terms of our ROK-U.S. alliance. But I think eventually you'll find a new rationale. That's what Japan did, with the United States. And this will be in the direction of thinking about regional thing, I think, generally speaking. But as to the question of Trump military planning and consequences of failure, I mean, I can be wrong, of course, but I believe North-South summit will succeed in one way or another. But the US-North Korea summit may fail in one way or another. Or they may not even reach that stage, but I don't know. But that's my general feeling. But even if US-North Korea summit fails, I think North Korea, in a way, made a somewhat strategic decision for the time being. And I think their current approach will remain for some time to come, regardless of the outcome of the summit. And there may be some tense moment in the process. But I think this would mean North Korea would come up with different kinds of approaches. And I don't know what they have in store. But so depending on what they propose, I think we have to respond. I think this process may continue for some time to come without necessarily reaching any comfortable agreement. And so for North Korea to stop doing that, what would take, I'm not quite sure, and how long it would take, I'm not quite sure. But for the time being, I think North Korea's change of course is somewhat strategic in a certain context, if not ultimately. And so U.S. Military planning, U.S. Attempting to resort to this, I think is not going to happen. That's how, as long as North Korea keeps its basic approach. And I may be wrong,
but actually for that, maybe I can ask the question to Victor about the possibility of military options and the nature of military options, because there's lots of rumors. If actually the Trump-Kim Jong-un summit fails, and then, of course, they say most media cover, military options is the only one remaining option U.S. has. So is that true? Because actually last November, December, in January this year, bloody nose option was the kinds of buzzword in Washington, D.C.
Never heard of it.
Really?
So I think that for many folks who look at this, that's the danger of doing a summit so quickly. I think if everybody could have their choice, they would like to see a negotiation take place, the end point of which might be a summit. The dangers, you know, it's entirely possible that these two leaders could meet and they could commission on high principles about denuclearization and peace, and then have people like Danny Russel go and negotiate that over 18 to 24 months. But that's not what, you know, but it's entirely possible that it could not go well at all. In which case, you know, the only thing beyond the summit is a cliff, right? And then I think people get worried about what comes next. And then on the alliance, I mean, I entirely agree with what Ambassador Han Sung-ju said. At the same time, I feel like the NATO cases and the U.S. ROK are slightly different. I mean, and that personally, it's hard for me to imagine that if there were actually a permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula, that this would have natural repercussions in terms of way both domestic publics looked at the utility of the alliance. I think it would impact the way South Koreans looked at China. It would impact the way the United States looked at what the role of the U.S.-Korea alliance would be, you know, a more regional alliance, things of this nature. So I think there are first order, second order, and third order effects that it would be hard to imagine that we could have peace on the peninsula and the alliance remaining the way it is. It's very difficult to imagine that. So.
Okay, Bruce?
I think we have to remember that many of the American feelings in the 1990s was we now had a permanent peace in Europe, that things had gone really well, and that we weren't going to have to worry about the future in Europe, that we had to maintain a good NATO and hedge a little bit. But then things changed, and we are now back to a more adversarial situation. I noted a White House release just the other day that said that a year ago, only 3 of the countries in NATO were up to the 2% defense budget level they were supposed to be. But now 8 of the countries are. The situation has changed, and we may hope that we get a permanent peace with Kim Jong-un, but he might change his mind. He might pass away and have a new leader in North Korea who has a different approach. We have to be prepared to hedge against a range of future situations. So yes, I would prefer an alliance which adjusts somewhat to more a regional kind of operation and role. Why not send American troops to China to do military exercises with Chinese forces? A great idea. Create understanding. But I think we still have to realize that things, even though they look really great today, and they may not after Friday, could go bad. And we have to be prepared to cover each possibility.
Okay, Song-han and Danny Russel.
Failure of the talks and the possibility of military option. I think how talks will be failing or have failed is another variable. If everybody finger points to North Korea, I think President Trump will or might suggest other friends and allies to continue to put pressure through sanctions, mainly economic sanctions. But if President Trump as well as Washington establishment believe this has failed mainly due to South Korea, or has South Korea in the process of implementation virtually spoiled the implementation, quick implementation. If this kind of view is shared among Washington establishment, I think the likelihood for the military option, I think, will increase.
Okay, thank you. Russel?
Well, the question is, what would failure look like? Now, in a summit meeting between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump, you've got a meeting of two decisive, powerful, willful, prickly, impulsive, maybe vain leaders with big egos and with nuclear weapons. So what could possibly go wrong? But I'd say, in all seriousness, that there's a different kind of failure that we need to worry about. Because one of the leaders is coming to a summit with a very well-developed strategy, and the other one is winging it. And the risk we have to militate against is that of a fundamentally flawed understanding or misunderstanding at a high level. The net effect is to exceed, perhaps inadvertently, to Kim Jong-un's strategy, which is to get the legitimization of his de facto nuclear status and to prove that there is a pathway to becoming a nuclear power in sheer defiance of international law, in direct contravention of UN Security Council resolutions. And by setting up this phony deal where the West is buying or renting, I should say, peace and quiet, or relative calm in exchange, as Bruce pointed out, for a lot of words that won't survive the first brush with implementation. There is, I think, a tremendous set of negative implications for the global non-proliferation regime, for the credibility of American-led deterrence and the nuclear umbrella, and more simply for the credibility of the United States as a guarantor of regional and global security. And I think that's a nightmare scenario.
Okay. Now we have come to the end of this session. Of course, there should be no daylight between the ROK and US in dealing with not only North Korea, but also the other regional as well as global issues. So I like to say, we go together. 같이 갑시다. Join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We will now take a 15-minute break. Our second plenary session will begin in this room at 2:45. Thank you.